Hello, everyone. My name is Garvin, and I read things and natter about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today, we're on our third installment of cities that once were lost, but now are found. Before we get started, though, just a couple of announcements. First, hopefully, you're noticing an increase in audio quality as I have upgraded to a new mic. This microphone was a gift from a friend, and I would just like to publicly thank them here and now. You guys would know him as Mr. Davis and his wonderful wife. Thank you guys. I appreciate this. Also, I know I said I would cover Hattusa, and I will, but today is Native American Day in the United States. So I've decided to talk to you about the biggest city north of Mexico before the arrival of the Europeans, anyways. That's the city of Cahokia, located in modern day southern Illinois. It was built and abandoned before Europeans even arrived to the area, but it's still something of a marvel to me. So let's get to it, shall we? Cahokia was the biggest city built north of Mexico before the arrival of European colonists, as I mentioned earlier. It was also a center of the Mississippi mound builder culture. They were one of a group of Native American cultures who built large towns around a large earth mound in the center, and most of those mounds would have a structure built on top, sometimes a temple, sometimes a home of an elite, like the town chief. The mounds were often used for burials as well. Now, I'm not going to talk about every mound building culture because that means covering a time period from somewhere around 3500 BC to the early 1600s AD, and a stretch of land from the east coast of the modern United States to Arkansas and as far south as northern Florida up to above the Great Lakes. We're basically talking about a massive amount of time and space here. The Mississippians, in specific, emerged around 800 AD and continued until about 1600 AD, and they directly controlled a large chunk of the modern American South and Midwest, centered on the Mississippi River system, hence Mississippi mound building culture, right? They were also the center of a massive trade network that reached from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, from the east coast of North America to the Rocky Mountains. This is super impressive to me because these guys don't have horses, they don't have carts, they don't have roads. So all these trade goods were carried basically in packs or by hand. And that is a long distance to walk, man. The Mississippi mound builders were agriculturalists. They grew maize, beans, and squash, and lived in villages and large towns. Their mounds tended to be square or rectangular and led down to large plazas, which were used for a variety of public ceremonies, rituals, and ball games even. Cahokia shows its first signs of early settlement during the early phase of the Mississippi mound building culture, where, due to its location, it became a center of trade until about 1050 AD. This is where the complexity of the culture on the site and the amount of construction explodes in what's called a cultural Big Bang. To give you an example, we have Monk's Mound, which is about 30 meters tall. That's 98 feet tall in freedom measurements, folks, and has a base of 17 acres. That's a lot. To give you a height comparison, the walls of Constantinople, considered some of the most imposing walls built in Europe, were 12 meters, so less than half the height of this mound. I also want to point out that they moved all this earth by hand. There were 120 mounds in Cahokia alone. They didn't have horses, like I mentioned. They didn't have any draft animals. They didn't even have metal tools or wheelbarrows. So this was all done using stone tools and their hands. Although, if I'm going to be fair, the Romans didn't have wheelbarrows either, as they didn't show up in Europe until the early 1200s AD. Weird fun fact, guys. Wheelbarrows have been invented exactly once in China, and we can trace the wheelbarrow movement from east to west in a very clear case of cultural diffusion. It's kind of wild. From 1100 AD to 1200 AD appears to be the height of Cahokia's wealth and power. We found goods made from copper, seashells, and shark's teeth, which would have required specialized craftsmen. So it seems Cahokia became a place where various luxury and ritual goods were created and handed out, as well as a center of ceremony and rituals. We have evidence of class-based residences with small lower-class homes, larger and nicer middle-class homes, and large, luxurious upper-class homes. Those were usually built on top of mounds, which has started an interesting debate over what kind of society Cahokia was. Part of the problem is that the people of the society never developed a writing system, so we're left to interpret it and infer things from the artifacts they left behind. So, in my admittedly less than expert research, I came across two distinct arguments that I will now present to you. The first and simplest is that Cahokia was what we call a chieftain state or a chieftainhood. These are societies or states around a single charismatic leader who usually justifies his rule through some claim of bloodline or divine authority, and he or she maintains their rule by basically collecting taxes, usually in the form of surplus food or goods, and handing those out to people who need them. The chief is usually backed up by an elite class that is hereditary in nature, although it doesn't have to be hereditary, just to be clear. What's the difference between a chief and a king, some of you may be asking, and, well, it's a hotly debated line. And you shouldn't consider me any sort of authority, but in all honesty, when I dig into it, what seems to be the dividing line that everyone hems and haws and dances around? Writing. The people we call kings and queens mostly come from societies that have writing systems or in close contact with societies that have them. Europeans, the Indians, the Chinese, the Japanese all have writing systems. The Mongols, the Huns, and other nomadic groups whose leaders we call kings are in close contact with writing societies. The societies with leaders we call chiefs aren't. This tends to privilege old world societies and does lead itself to a Eurocentric view of social development. For those of you wondering, Eurocentric means you're basically viewing everything from a European point of view, which could be a problem because not everyone's history happened the same way that European history did. This is a reoccurring problem in the social sciences. The second point of view is the argument that Cahokia was something called a theater state, which is a state where the whole point of the society is to produce grand spectacles through ritual, ceremony, performances, or just parties and games and feast. You could almost think of this as, what if Hollywood or Bollywood were independent states run by the movie studios? Now, don't just think of the movies, but also the award ceremonies, the galas, and so on that studios and other organizations attached to Hollywood and Bollywood and other, such things throw. And imagine an entire state devoted to doing just that. People would have come to Cahokia to be part of these rituals and engage in these practices. You could compare it to people going to Mecca, Jerusalem, Rome, or Hollywood or Bollywood. In that sense, Cahokia would have been a religious and cultural center, and people would have been going to see and be part of mass dances, feasts, grand games, religious ceremonies. The elites would have lost or gained status by their ability to gather resources to put on these grand public events. This is honestly a fascinating idea, and I hope to find more sources on it so I can explore it in more depth someday. That said, during the 1200s, Cahokia would suffer a decline as the population would fall and fortifications were erected. The reasons for the fortifications are in dispute. For example, some scholars try to claim it's a flood control measure, but there's no evidence of flooding, and studies have come back showing no real soil erosion from floods at the time. So it doesn't appear like floods were an issue. That said, we don't have any material evidence of widespread warfare either. Although I do have to note, during Cahokia's heyday, fertility symbolism was dominant, and during its decline, they were replaced by symbols of war and warfare. So that's kind of circumstantial evidence to me. Either way, by 1275 AD, the city was in a death spiral and would fully collapse by 1350 AD. There doesn't seem to be any single great catastrophe that befell the city, so much that it was gradually abandoned and its residents fled into rural villages and towns in the region. Their rituals would survive the fall of the city and spread out amongst the tribes of the Southeast, Midwest, and Great Plains. For example, the sun dance that tribes of the Great Plains would practice does show elements of the rituals we see recorded in the Cahoan artifacts. It would be resettled by the Cahokian Indian tribe generations later. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. I really am. The Cahokians may or may not have been related to the original mound builders. No one's really sure on that. The Mississippi mound builders and a related culture called the ancient fort builders would, however, survive the fall of the city, at least until they came into contact with a Spanish adventurer named Hernando de Soto around 1520 AD, who recorded them as living in what he considered complex city-states ruled by people he called kings and queens. His expedition, which led to his death, something I can't say I'm sorry about, was also a disaster for the natives, which I am sorry about. Not only did he directly kill thousands of them in combats and raids, resulting from his attempts to brute force tribute from them instead of trading for goods, his expedition likely introduced smallpox and influenza to the natives, the resulting epidemic utterly destroying their already ravaged civilization. By the time other Europeans began to push into the area in the late 1600s, early 1700s, there were no great mound settlements left, as native society in the region never really recovered from the plagues, and in a handful of generations they would have to turn around and face a torrent of settlers eager to take land for themselves and uncaring about who else had a claim to it. The area of Cahokia was settled by Europeans who pushed out the native tribes, and in 1831 a man named Amos bought a plot of land that included Monk's Mound. He sank a well and found artifacts and human bones. The story spread until Thomas Ramey bought the site in 1864 and began to attempt to preserve it and encourage real archaeological investigation, although he was limited by his time's understanding of archaeology and the time's technology. Meanwhile, people came up with all sorts of theories as to what the mounds were and who built them, crediting everyone from lost Vikings to Atlantis to the Welsh to the lost tribes of Israel. That last one is an early American obsession that really needs its own discussion, so we're going to leave that alone for right now. Back to Cahokia, it wasn't until the 1960s that serious excavations began using backhoes. Again, the limits of technology, everyone. However, those excavations allowed us to really start understanding the history of the site and forcing everyone to admit the truth that Native Americans built these mounds and the cities around them. Today, Cahokia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the largest archaeological site in North America, north of Mexico. With that, I think this is a good place to stop the video. I hope you found it interesting or at least entertaining. If so, please leave a like, a comment, or even subscribe. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. Speaking of helping me in my eternal struggle, my thanks to my biggest supporter, Big Steve, over on Patreon. If you would like a shout out on my videos, or if you just want to say in future content, or a peek at patron-only content, consider joining the Everwise patrons for only $1 a month. The link is in the description below. It's above the massive list of sources used. I hope you guys enjoy those sources, because this is really just meant as an introduction to this city, and those sources should help you dive deeper. Next week, for sure, we're going to Hattusa. I hope you join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.